So the last Husky, this is by Farley Mowat. He has a little quote here, but basically the ties that bind man and his dog can be of many strengths. Anyone here own a dog? Or like your family has a dog? Or a pet or anything, right? Like you have those ties with them, right? Like you have a relationship. You care about them. They care about you. Hopefully, if you have a cat, they don't care about you. But my cats hate me. No, they love me, but sometimes they would eat me if I ever died. So the ties which bound Arnuk to old Mactuck, we'll learn about who these are, were beyond human strength to break. Canada's north can be a cruel and savage land, so we know it's talking about the north. Man, animal, and the elements, the weather, are so inextricably linked together that to mention one without the others is meaningless. Few writers illustrate this fundamental truth better than Farley Mowat does in this exciting and moving story about the dog Arnuk. So we already have an introduction to one of our characters here. Arnuk is one of the main characters. It's a dog. Now, before we had talked about, I'll get into reading it right after, but before we had talked about just 3 human characters, right? One of our main characters is a dog now. Why might that be a harder thing to write about? Yeah, dog can't say its emotions. The dog can't like think the way a human can, right? So immediately that becomes more difficult to write about. So how can a dog express itself? Barking. If you're ever like making food or something, you have a dog just sitting there right beside you. Maybe it's whining a little bit, hungry, it wants food. So it needs to do other things than speak into, it needs to use its body language, right? For the most part, its body and voice. So let's get into this. So the people built a little igloo and departed into the wastelands. They went from the place singing the laments for the dying. They left nothing left behind them except the old man. So they left an old man behind them. They even took Arnuk, the dog, for it was the old man's wish, and Arnuk was the last and most precious gift that an old man could make to his son and to his grandson and to his people. So they're leaving, and they're leaving an old man behind. Why are they leaving this guy behind, you think? He's old. Can't really help out as much as he can anymore, right? It's a cold and it's a hard wasteland. We've talked about this already. We already know this. So it's really important that he leaves. And his dog is a really important thing. So we're going to learn why. So he left his dog to his son and his grandson, and they left him behind to die, really. It had been a bitter season, the long, hungry months before the spring. And in the camp of the people, there had been endless cries of children who were too young to know that starvation must be faced in silence. Okay, so there had been death in the camp, not of men, but of those who were almost as important to the continuance of human life. For the dogs had died one by one, and as each was stilled in death, so did man's hope for the future shrink. Okay, so when a dog dies, their hopes for the future shrinks. The dogs are as important as people here. How come, you think? Sorry? Sled dogs, that's one of the reasons. You're absolutely right. They need their help to be able to survive. Remember, it's a cold, harsh wasteland. So this entire thing really important, right? It's a cold, harsh wasteland. You could even write that here if you wanted. But for in the Stark Plains country of the barren lands, men and dogs are in need for each other. So they have a really important relationship to survive. When you lose a dog, it's like losing another person in your community. Yet though it had been a bitter time, there had been no words spoken against the folly of feeding one old and useless human. Mactuck, the son, had shared his own meager rations equally between his aged father and his starving child, who also bore the name that linked the 3 together. So they're all called Mactuck. No word was ever spoken, but on a dark April day, the old man raised himself slowly from the sleeping ledge and gazed for a little while at his grandchild. And out of the depths of a great love and greater courage, old Mactuck spoke these words. I have it in my heart, he said, that the deer await you at the western lakes. Go quickly to them, else you will remain in this empty place forever. Go when morning comes, and I will say, and you shall take Arnuk with you, that in the years ahead of you, you will remember me and not forget to leave the spirit's gifts upon my grave. So this entire thing, what he's saying here is, Again, they're starving here. We've just established this. They are starving. So what's he going to do? They're going to move. They're going to move and they're going to leave him behind and they're going to take his dog with them. That's what they're saying here. There had been no discussion and no argument, for even an old man has its rights, and this is his final one. This is his dying wish, right? This is a father telling his son and grandson, leave me behind to die. There had been no discussion and no argument. How come you wouldn't fight this? Sorry? Well, the old man made his choice. So one is his dying wish. That's one of the reasons. And the other one is, any guesses? He's too old to travel. There's the understanding that, this is something that needs to be done. It's a cold, harsh reality. We need to make this statement. So already it's a cold and harsh thing. Oh, well, the weather's going to be cold and harsh. So we already see some of those links. There's a tough decision that has to be made. So in the morning, the people were gone, and behind young Mactuck's sled, so we have old Mactuck and we have young Mactuck. Sled the dog Arnuk tugged convulsively at his tether and turned her head back towards the small white mound of the abandoned igloo, rising shadowless against the endless snows. Arnuk had been born in the preceding spring in lean times that always gripped the land before the deer returned. She was the 7th pup of the litter, and there was no food for her. And if an old man had not taken it upon himself to feed and care for her, she would have died before her life began. Yet she saw the summer come and knew the pleasures of long days spent romping with the other young dogs by the side of the great river where the summer camp was pitched. When she grew tired, she would come to the skin tent and push against the old man's knees until he opened his aged eyes and smiled at her. And so she grew through the good summer months, and the people in the camp gazed at her almost with awe, for she became beautiful and of the size and strength surpassing that of any other dog in the camp. So the runt turned into some really, really strong dog, the strongest one. And when the winter came, she thrust her shoulders into the harness. So whoever said sled dog, you're right. So she thrust her shoulders into the harness with the other young dogs, and she gave freely of her strength to men. In the winter evenings, she came to the igloo, and this was permitted by Mactuck the son, for he knew the comfort that his father took from the feel of her thick fur against his ancient body. Mactuck the elder gave her the name she bore, Arnuk the woman, for she was the wife and mother to him in the last winters of his years. So we know what her name means now. It means the woman. Because there can be no death while there is birth, old Mactuck himself insisted that his dog be mated in the late winter days when the moon stands still, and the wild dogs, the great white wolves, howl of their passion to the flickering northern lights. So it was arranged for Arnuk, born with the promise of a strength that would be the people's strength in years to come. So what they're saying is their future rests on this dog, right? The goal of this dog is it's really strong. They're going to breed it with other dogs, right? And logically, well, you get really strong pups then. And when Mactuck the elder felt the throb of new life in the womb of the woman, he was content. So what's this saying? Throb of new life in the womb of the woman? Yeah, Arnuk's pregnant. That's what that means. Throb of new life in the womb of the woman. Well, the woman's Arnuk. New life in the womb, well, it means pregnant. Their goal was to make her have lots of kids. Well, they're starting to succeed in that. So she's pregnant. For his love of his dog was very great, and her life was his life too. The spring hunger had already begun before Arnuk was mated, and the famine grew with the passing days. Again, we're in a famine. The older dogs died first, yet near the end, even Arnuk's litter mates lay stiff and silent in the snows. But Arnuk's strength was great, and when there was some scrap of bone or skin that the people could spare, she received it. For in her womb lay the hopes of many to come. So we're starving, right? And particularly who's starving? The people and the dogs. And the dogs they're dying off. First, it was the old ones, less useful, but the young ones are even starting to die off now too. This was the way of things when people turned from the lonely igloo and dragging the sleds with their own failing muscle, set their faces to the west. The ties that bind man and his dog can be of many strengths, but the ties which bound Arnuk to old Maktuk were beyond human strength to break. How come they have such a big bond? They relied on each other for survival, right? Remember, mentioned earlier that, oh, well, this dog was the runt of the litter. There was no food for her. Who took the time to care for her, feed her? Old Maktuk. So Arnuk went with the people, but resisting fiercely. How come she's resistant? Old Maktuk is not with them. And on the third day of the journey, she gnawed through the rawhide tether, and before dawn, she had vanished into the swirling ground drift of the windswept darkness. So what did she do? She escaped. She gnawed through her harness, right? She escaped. And this is our first instance where one of our first instances where we're seeing a mention of the landscape. Remember, the landscape is really important towards a lot of these stories. The windswept darkness, the swirling ground drift of it. Windswept darkness, as in when she leaves, we're in a period of darkness now. In the morning, Maktuk, the son, held the frayed tether in his hands, and his face was filled with sorrow of the foreboding. Foreboding. Probably a word we haven't encountered much before. Basically, it means like what's coming in the future. So his face was filled with sorrow of what's coming in the future. So the dog escapes. What does this mean? They're like, remember, their hopes is on this dog and all the kids, the pups that she's gonna be able to reproduce. All of their dogs are dead. The people are the ones who are pushing these sleds across the snow now. So when she leaves, what this means is that eventually, like their entire community is probably going to die in the future because of this. Yet when he spoke to his family, it was with these words: "What must be surely cannot be denied. The woman has gone to my father, and she will be with him when the Snow Walker comes." Who's the Snow Walker? And no, it's not something from Game of Thrones. Any guesses? Well, so they left the old man and they left him to what's going to happen to him? He's going to die. Yeah. And so so the dog's going back to the old man right now. And we know he's going to die. Like he's by himself. He's laying in bed all day. And when the Snow Walker comes, so the Snow Walker in this case, what do we think that might reference? The Grim Reaper, right? Death. Yeah. Yeah. So the Snow Walker in this case is, you can name it whatever you want, the Reaper, like the death, whatever it is. Either of those would be fine. I'm just going to put death just for I don't have a lot of space, but you could put Grim Reaper. That's totally fine. We know what that is. Mouse. But my father's spirit will know of our need, and perhaps the day will dawn when he will return the woman to us. For if she does not come, the years ahead are dark. So remember, he will return the woman to us. He ain't going nowhere. He knows his father's going to die. So he's referring to his father's like spirit or wishes in this point, right? This is not him literally saying, yeah, my dad's going to walk up with her. That's not what's going to happen. They've been traveling for 3 days at this point. As for Arnuk, she reached the little igloo before dawn broke the next day. And when the old man opened his eyes to see it was the Snow Walker at last, he saw the dog instead. And he smiled and laid his bony hand upon her head, and once more he slept. The Snow Walker was late in the coming, but on the 7th day he came unseen, and when he passed from the place, the bond was broken. So he died, right? This is him dying. He died after 7 days. So they traveled for 3 days. It took her a 4th day to get back, so she laid by his side for 3 days. So day 5, 6, 7, she laid by his side. On the 7th, he dies. And this bond was broken, right? He's dead now. Like that, no, they're saying that this bond is broken. Not necessarily like that, not necessarily. Like if anyone's ever had like a pet, maybe there's someone in your home, they leave, they move, whatever. Sometimes that animal gets sad, right? Yet it was not broken, for Arnuk lingered with her dead for 3 days more. So days 8, 9, and 10. And then it was the wind, perhaps, that whispered the unspoken order. Go to the people, go. So for 10 days, she's been away. Sorry, 7 days she was away. And then on the 10th day, she decides that she needs to go back to the village or go back to the community. When she emerged from the igloo, she had found her world had been obliterated beneath a heavy blizzard. Her world had been obliterated. Her world had been obliterated. This is talking literally about the weather, but this is also a metaphor, right? Remember, a lot of this has to do with the landscapes. This old man that she loved just died. So this is a metaphor with the landscape. This. For a while, she stood in the pale winter sun, her coat gleaming against the purple shadows, and then she turned her face with its broad, rough, and wide-spaced amber eyes towards the west, for that way lay her path. And within her, the voices of unborn generations echoed the voice of the wind, but with a greater urgency. Go to the tents of man, they told her, go. Unborn generations, right? It's referring to the fact, again, that she's pregnant. With her head down and her great plume held low, she moved east or westward into the pathless space. And only once did she pause to turn and stare for a long minute at her back trail, waiting for some final sign. There was no final sign, and at length she turned away. This was the beginning of her journey. Death had severed the bonds that held her to one man, but she was still bound fast to man. Oops. Through the untold generations, the fate of her kind had been one with that of man. Back through the long, dim sweep of time, even before the Eskimos drifted west across the island chain from Asia. This is saying for generations, for decades, for centuries, for a long time, dogs and man had a relationship here in this area, right? That's what that's saying. Arnuk was one of the people, and her need of them was as great as their need of her. And in this hour, her need was truly great. For through the long days in the igloo, she had eaten nothing. Remember, it's been 10 days. And now her hunger was sixfold. For within her, the new life waxed on the substance of her body. She was in a desperate hurry to renew the links with men, and so she drove herself. She did not halt even when the darkness swept the bleak plains into obscurity. At midnight, she came to the place where she had chewed her way free of young Maktuk's sled. She knew it was the place only by an inner sense, for the snow had leveled all signs and had drifted in all trails. She circled amongst the hard drifts, whining miserably, for terrible doubts had begun to seize upon her. She climbed a rock ridge to test the night air for some sign of that men were near. Sense came to her, the acrid odor of a white fox unseen in the darkness, and the unbearably desirable odor of an Arctic hare that had fled into invisibility at her approach, but there was no scent of man. Her whines rose to a crescendo, a wild pleading in the darkness, but there was no answer except the rising moan of the wind. At this length, worn into a stupor by the weight of her hunger and by her loneliness, she curled up in the shelter of a drift and lost herself in dreams. So the dog slept in the heart of the unfathomable wilderness, but as she dozed uneasily, a profound change was taking place in the secret places of her body. A strange alchemy was at work, right? Alchemy, almost like wizardry, some sorcery. A strange alchemy was at work. She lay with her nose outstretched on her broad forepaws, and her muscles twitched with erratic impulses. Saliva flowed to her mouth, and it was the taste of blood. In her mind's eye, she laid the stride to that of the swift deer, and her teeth met in the living flesh, and she knew the savage ecstasy of the last quiver in a dying prey. So she's dreaming, right? From somewhere out in time, the ageless instincts that liven all living cells were being reborn, so that the dog and the new life within her would not perish. So what's happening to her? She's awakening her instincts, right? And when Arnok raised her head to the dawn light, the thing was done, the change complete. Okay, so dawn light, right? Dawn, new day, start of a new day. And what happened? She changed. So again, we see another metaphor here that's taken place. So we see another metaphor for change. Specifically with the landscape and what's happening to one of our characters, right? The dawn was clear, and Arnok, her perceptions keenly sharpened by the chemistry of change, tested the wind. When she found the warm smell of living flesh, she rose to seek it out. Not far distant, a snowy owl, dead white and shadowless in the pre-dawn, had earlier swept across the plains with great eyes staring. The owl had seen and fallen so swiftly on a hare that the beast had known nothing until the echelon talons clutched its life and took it from him. It was a good kill, and the owl felt pleasure as it perched above the corpse. The great bird savored the weight of its own hunger, and while it sat complacent, crouched above the hare, it did not see the flow of motion on a nearby drift. Arnok was a weasel creeping up upon a mouse, a snake slithering upon a sparrow. Skills she had never known, skills that had come to her in all completedness from forgotten half-beast lost in the dimmest eons were now her, right? Her instincts. When she was a dozen feet away, the owl raised its head, and the yellow eyes of a bird stared with expressionless intensity full into Arnok's face. Arnok was the stillness of death, yet every muscle vibrated in the grip of passion such as she had never known before. And when the owl turned back to its prey, Arnok leapt. The owl saw the beginning of the leap and threw itself backwards into its own element, and with a smooth thrust of mighty winds. But those wings were a fraction slow, and the still hurtling form of a dog, leaping 6 foot in the air, struck flesh beneath the feathers. It was a brief battle. 3 times the talons of the bird drew blood, and then they stiffened and relaxed in death. All right, so successful hunt. Hungry dog, pregnant dog, finally gets some food. Arnok slept afterwards, while the white feathers blew into the bleak distance, and tufts of white fur moved like furtive little things in the grip of the wind. And when she awoke again in the agony of her hunger was at the end, and the savage drive of her new instincts was momentarily dulled. Once more she was man's beast and lost. She woke, and without a glance at the red snow beside her, set out again into the west, unconscious, yet directly driven. The people whom she sought were wanderers on the face of a plain, so vast that it seemed limitless. The dog could not conceive of the odds against her finding them, but in her memory was the image of the summer camp where she had spent her youth. With an unearned perseverance, she set her course for that far distance place. So she's been to this place before. That's where she thinks that they're going to be, right? So they move every spring and every winter, basically, to where the food are, where the deer are. A day and night and nearly 100 miles of scattered rock ridges where the snow demons rose and whirled like dancing spirits. Snow demons, dancing spirits, whirled. You know, that's some imagery basically for the landscape. Maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. We'll get to that. Snow demons rose and whirled like dancing spirits, separated her from the place of the owl before weariness brought her to a new halt again. And in all that space, she had seen no traces of men. Few were the beasts or birds that moved upon their sullen desolation, and the world seemed empty of all forms of life except the dog. Yet this was an illusion, and Arnok, sleeping fitfully in a snow hollow, was roused to reality by the new senses that had quickened in her. She sat up abruptly, and the long hair of ruff lifted stiffly. The white dawn was breaking, but this time it brought no promises of food. Instead, it brought cold fear. So this is an example here of something we call foreshadowing. Basically, this is hinting at, hey, something's going to happen. Arnok could not tell how she had been warned, and yet the warnings were implicit. Her ruff was a flag of her courage, and she growled deep in her broad chest. There was nothing to be seen or heard or smelled, and yet she knew, right? Instincts. Leaping from her snowbed, she raced towards the long line of a gravel ridge that had been burnished clear of snow by the winter gales. The light was breaking when she reached the high ground, and there were two large rocks that stood up like tombstones. She took her stand facing her back trail, and at last she saw the shadows, 4 of them, weaving and fading in dim light, but drawn always closer. So we have some foreshadowing here. So first off, these things here are what are going to be. Remember we talked about those snow demons? These are the snow demons. Any guesses what they are? Wolves, good guess. Any other guesses? Maybe a bear or something? Yeah, so good guesses. Let's find out. She knew them. Many times while she lived in security of men's camps, those shadows had circled beyond the firelight, singing and their blood-stirring songs. And the dogs of men had lifted their heads and flung back the challenge with a hysterical ferocity. For the dogs of men and the dogs of the wilderness walk apart, theirs being the hatred of brothers who have denied their common blood. So they're wolves. Correct. They're Arctic wolves. And so we see our first instance here. Remember, it's mentioned a lot of times that the men rely on the dogs, right? But the dogs equally rely on the men. How come? What's bigger, a dog or a wolf? A wolf. And the wolves hate them, but they don't go near. They don't go near the security of the men's camps, right? So how come the dogs need the men? Well, for security against these wolves. We have a pretty good understanding of why the men need the dogs. So now we know. Now we have an understanding of how come that other side of that relationship works. So, for the dogs of men and the dogs of the wilderness walk apart, there's been the hatred of brothers who have denied their common blood. Again, if we wanted to even go even further, we have 2 huge rocks that stood up like tombstones. Again, this is a metaphor. She's afraid for her life. It's where you bury something. There's 2 of them. One would be her. What do you think the other like death would be? Could be the old man. Could be the puppies. Could be what they all represent, like the future of the next generation. You could make any one of those claims, like, right? That works. But this would be another example here of, again, that landscape referring to our characters, to the story. Arnok was afraid. She crouched close to the rocks and waited while the shadows flickered in the rising dawn, drew closer, and halted silently a dozen yards away. Dimly, Arnok understood that her law had been broken, and that when she had come unannounced into the territory of the wolves, she had invited death. So a law that had been broken, right? There's territory here, basically. That's the law that's been broken. So she invited death. Hatred of the others welled up within her. The new forces that had come and gave her a savage will to live. Her lips drew back and her white teeth glistened as she tensed herself for war. It must be that miracles are not reserved for men alone, for a miracle came to pass upon that wind-swept ridge where the leader of the wolves, a gaunt and graying giant, stood and tested the dawn wind. He faced Arnok, his grizzled muzzle wrinkling in a strange perplexity, and after one dreadful moment of poised immobility, his straining muscles eased, and incredibly from his massive chest, there came an almost plaintive whine. The wind blew gustily, and a veil of driven snow rolled up to the edge, and when it passed, the dog Arnok was alone. The wolves had vanished utterly, swallowed by the anonymity of night, and the dog understood that she was spared. How come you think that the dog got spared? Well, they were right in front of her, though. So they knew where she was. They were closer than you and I were. Oh yeah, I guess, yeah. But they knew where she was, but they chose to leave.
Maybe because it was the leader, maybe he sensed their fear.
Okay, so maybe the leader sent something, the rest of them followed. You're right. So the leader decided something. The leader caught wind of something, right? He understood something.
Maybe that she was pregnant, scared too.
Maybe that she was pregnant. So let's find out. Perhaps she may have understood that there are many laws amongst the other, and chief of it all, is one which gives immunity to a female ripe with new life, even though she'd been an outlander from a different world. So we talk about these laws, right? This law of you don't go into someone else's territory. There's also a law that, well, you don't attack something that's pregnant. So yeah, so you're right. She was pregnant. So the wolves had known, and Arnuk once more took upon her journey, aware that there was peace between her and the wild ones whose land this was. The days passed, and after each, the sun stood a little higher in the sky. So I want to quickly talk about this. So this is really far up North Canada, right? They don't have the same, I don't know what you call it, sun cycle as we do, right? Like some days, like it's just permanently daylight there, and other times it's permanently night there for like weeks, months on end. So that's what we're experiencing, right? We're getting this change of. Yeah, like so it's really far up north, right? So this is just kind of talking about this. Maybe this means something is that it went from this like nighttime to brighter and brighter. The sun is standing a little higher in the sky every single day. This might mean something. We're gonna mark it just in case. It doesn't hurt. Remember, this is our first read through. We're not sure of this stuff. This is why we're marking it. When we come back to it, we can try and analyze this stuff. Space lengthened under the dog's feet, and the explosion of spring disturbed the world. The snows grew soft, and the barren rivers, freed from their chains, thundered angrily across the plains. So I just want to quickly talk about this. An explosion of spring. The snows grew soft. The rivers freed and were thundering angrily across the plains. That's descriptive writing, right? That stuff wasn't happen literally. There wasn't an actual explosion of like flowers and grass. This is just all descriptive writing. We're going to get into that more next week, but it's just an example of it. In a white glaring sky flight of ravens, hung like eddies the burned leaves on the opening ponds, geese mingled with the rapacious flocks of gulls. The awakening of life was in the deep moss, where the lemons tunneled, and it was the stony ridges where ptarmigan swaggered before their mates. It was in all living things and in all places, and it was within the womb of the dog Arnott. So what is we had another example here. What's it? Well, so it mentions the pups, but the pups themselves aren't it. Sorry. So what's happening to the landscape? With spring, we get a whole bunch of new life, right? So this growing of life. It's this big explosion of life. So when we talk about it's talking about this explosion of life. Whenever we see it, we want to actually understand like what the heck is it? I'm just going to put new life, right? And that's why it mentions Arnuk here, right? So again, we get another example here. We get the awakening of life. It's also talking about Arnuk here. So this is an example here of, again, more landscape. We have this explosion of spring. That's what it's referring to as new life. Her journey had been long, and her broad paws were crusted with the dried blood of 100 stone cuts. Her magnificent coat was matted now, and the lustrous under the spring sun. Nevertheless, she drew upon hidden strengths, and upon her indomitable will, she went forward into the western plains. Gaunt, hot-eyed, and terribly exhausted, she brought her quest to an end on a day in early June. They left in April. This is over a month. This has been at least a month. Breasting a long ridge, she saw before her the brilliant light of sun on Sorn water, and she recognized the river. She had come home. Whining with excitement, she ran clumsily down the slope, for her body had grown awakened in these last days. And soon she was amongst the rings of weathered boulders, where in the summer that was past, men's tents had stood. The tents were gone. There was no living man to welcome the return of the lost one. Only on the nearby ridges, the motionless pile of rocks that the Eskimos called Inukok, men of stone, were there to see the coming of Arnuk. So those like you guys have probably seen this, like those are those like stones that are built like that stuff. So that's what was left behind. They and the hidden piles of bones under rock cairns near the river, the old graves of the forgotten people. Arnok understood that this place was empty of living men, yet for an hour she refused to believe it. Pathetically, she ran from old tent ring to old meat shaft, sniffing each with a despair and hope, and finding nothing to give her hope. And when the realization became inescapable, the dog curled herself in a depression beside the place where old Mactuck had once held her at his knees, and she gave herself up to the great weariness and to her bitter disappointment. So we see another example of this bond, right? It's been a long time at this point. She's gone through hell and back. She's awakened her natural instincts and stuff, and she still remembers that old man. Yet the old camp was not as empty as it looked. While Arnok made her fruitless search, she had been too preoccupied to know that she was being watched. Had she glanced up to the river to a low cliff, she might have seen the little shape that followed her every move, with eyes that held them and a hunger not born in the belly. Eyes that held in them a hunger not born in the belly. So it's something that wants her, but not to like eat her, right? That's what it's saying here. What do they probably want? So something's watching her, but it doesn't have plans to like hunt her or eat her. Oh, sorry. I got two answers there.
Does it want the kids?
So maybe the kids and maybe curiosity. So let's find out. So she would have seen and recognized the wolf. Okay, so it's a wolf that's come here. Her hackles would have risen and her teeth would have been bared. So a wolf is following her, but it doesn't want to eat her. What the heck's going on? The wolf was almost as young as the dog. Born the preceding spring, he had stayed with his family for a full season until in the early spring of this year, the urge to wander had come over him and he had forsaken his ancestral territory. Many adventures had befallen him, and most had been bitter ones, for he had learned at the cost of torn flanks and bleeding shoulders that each wolf family guards its own land and there was no room for a stranger. So what do we have here? We have another outcast. Well, actually, kind of an outcast. This is a wolf that left by himself. It's a very young wolf. Doesn't have a home right now. His tentative offers had been met with bared teeth in the lands of the three wolf clans. Before at last he came to the river and found a place where no wolves were. It was a good place, not far from the empty Eskimo camp. The river flared angrily over a shallow stretch of rounded boulders to lose itself at the beginning of an immense lake. And at the shallow place, the caribou had made a ford in their spring and summer migrations. They crossed the river here and in untold thousands, and not all escaped the river's anger. The drowned bodies of dead deer lay among the rocks at the river mouth, and there was ample food for a great population of Arctic foxes, ravens, and white gulls. So what did he find? What did this wolf find? An empty land that's just filled with food. But the wolves of the area did not visit the place, for it belonged to man, and that which man claims to himself is forbidden to the great wild dogs. Again, we see more of this reference here that for the dogs here of this community, staying with man means protection, it means security. So we're seeing more of that, why that relationship is important to both of them. Knowing nothing of this prohibition, the young male wolf had taken up his home by the river, and here he nursed his loneliness. Perhaps even more than the dogs, wolves are social beasts, and the lone wolf is only a legend. Companionship in the hunt and in the games that are played after the hunt are vital to the happiness of great white beasts. Isolation from their own kind is a purgatory for them, and they can know a loneliness that eats away at the heart. It had been so with the young wolf, and when he saw and smelled the dog Arnok, he was filled with conflicting emotions. What emotions do you think are happening here? So we have a wolf and a dog. Well, so how come he's confused? Like, what are these different emotions? So it could be he's never seen a dog before. It's a very young wolf. That's one thing that we know. Now it's referenced in the story. Wild dogs and domesticated dogs. What do they think about each other? Yeah, they hate each other, and that's in their instincts, right? That was in their instincts. So that's probably one of those emotions. What do you think are maybe some of the other emotions? It's conflicting. So it'd be something that combats that anger or hate.
Maybe because she knows she's pregnant.
So maybe he senses that she's pregnant too. So maybe he's curious on that. And the other thing as well is we just talked about how these wolves are social beasts. They're not meant to be alone, right? The lone wolf is a legend. Well, might be a little bit excited to just, to see another dog, I guess. And again, she's a really big dog, so you could almost mistake her as a wolf. He had seen no dog before, so whoever said that, yes. Yet he sensed that the golden coated beast below him was not quite of his blood. So sense, again, we have that sense, not the same thing. The smell was strange, and yet it was familiar. The shape and color were strange, yet they roused in him a warmth of memory and desire. He had been rebuffed so many times before that he was cautious now. And when Arnok woke from her sleep of exhaustion, she did not at first see the stranger, but her nostrils told her at once of the nearness of deer meat. Her hunger was savage and overpowering. Without caution, she leapt to her feet and flung herself upon a ragged haunch of a caribou that had been dragged to within a few yards of her. Only when she had satisfied her first desperate hunger did she glance up and meet the still young gaze of the wolf. So a caribou that had been dragged within a few yards of her, there's no men around her, so obviously it had to be the wolf that did this, right? The wolf did the dragging. The wolf sat motionless 100 feet from the dog, nor did he so much as twitch an ear when Arnok's hackles lifted and the threat took form deep in her throat. He remained sitting, yet tensed the sprain away, and after a long minute, Arnok again dropped her head to the meat, satisfied that the wolf meant no harm. This was the way of their first meeting, the wolf and the dog, and this is what came of it. With the mockery of the second deserted camp before her, Arnok gave up on her search for men. She's given up. She went 4, 5, 6 weeks, a long time, and she's given up. She could no longer fight against the insistent demands of her heavy body, and there was no more time for searching. Insistent demands of her heavy body, well, she's pregnant, right? Probably about to give birth soon. Now, once again, in her hour of despair, the hidden force within her took command. Before the first day was out, her mood had changed magically from deep dejection to businesslike alertness. Ignoring the young wolf who still kept his distance, Arnok made a quick tour of the familiar ground beside the river. She carefully examined the carcasses of 5 drowned deer, and from each of these she chased the screaming gulls and guttural ravens. But this meat was hers now by right of greater strength. Then, satisfied with the abundant food supply, Arnok left the river and trotted briskly half a mile to where where a rock outcrop had opened its flank to form a shallow cave. Here, as a pup, Arnok had played with the other dogs of the camp. Now, as a full-grown female, she examined the cave with more serious intent. The place was dry and protected from the winds. There was only one thing wrong, and that was the smell of this cave. It was pervaded by a potent and unpleasant stench that caused Arnok to draw back her lips in anger and distaste. For no animal upon the face of the Great Plains has any love for the squat and ugly wolverine. So we have a third animal introduced, the wolverine. And a wolverine had clearly used the caves during the winter months. Arnok's nose told her that the wolverine had been gone for several weeks, and there was little likelihood he would return until the winter winds forced him to seek shelter. We're seeing a lot of mention of winds and stuff like that. We'll try and debrief on that if we can. Arnok scratched earth and the sand over the unclean floor, then set about dragging moss into the deepest recess. And here at last she hid herself and made surrender to her hour. So where did she go? She went in this cave. Arnok's pup were born on the 3rd day she spent in the cave. On a morning when the cries of the white geese were loud in the spring air. It was the time of birth. The 5 squirming things that lay warm across the dog's fur were not alone in their first day of life. On the sand ridges beyond the river, a female ground squirrel suckled the naked moors of flesh that were hers. And in a den by a ridge, a mile distant, an Arctic fox, already graying into a summer coat, thus his alert face above the ground with the feeble whimpers of the pups his mate was nursing, waymed him of the tasks ahead. So basically, again, we see more references here to the fact that, like her pups were not alone on their first day. It's spring, right? We see this spring air. We see this coming of geese. It's spring. It's a time when everyone's having their kids. All living things in the land by the river move to the rhythm of the demand of new life born or soon to be born. All things move to this rhythm except the outcast wolf. For the 3 days that Arnok remained hidden, the young wolf felt a torment that gave him no peace. Restless and yearning for the things he had never known, he haunted the vicinity of the cave. He dared not get too close, but each day he dragged a piece of deer meat within a few yards of the cave mouth and then back to wait with a pathetic patience for his gift to be accepted. On the third day, as he lay near the cave, snapping at the flies which hung above his head, his keen ears felt the faintest tremors of a new sound. He was on his feet instantly, head outthrust and his body trembling with attention. It came again, so faint that it was felt rather than heard. A tiny whimper that called to him across the ages and across all barriers. So, any guesses what that tiny whimper is? So what's he hearing in this case?
Puppy.
The puppies, yeah. After 3 days, he hears the puppies. But a whimper that calls him across the ages, across time, and across all barriers. Yeah, like fatherhood, right? Like, it's like it's this thing that's like within, I don't know, like it's hard to describe, but like there's this, again, this nature here. Yeah, like an instinctual thing, right? Like, when you see a baby, like no one has to tell you, hey, be really careful with the baby. You just kind of know, right? And in that instance, his loneliness was done. His great unease is at an end. He shook himself sharply and with one quick proprietary glance at the cave mouth, trotted out across the plain. No longer a solitary outcast, but a male beginning the evening hunt that would feed his pups and his mate. So again, when we're talking about that whimper that calls him across ages, it's that responsibility of fatherhood. That's what he wants to be here. So simply, and out of his deep need, the young wolf filled the void that has surrounded him through the torture and weeks of spring. Arnok did not easily accept the wolf in the role he had chosen to play. For several days, she kept him at bay with bare teeth, although she ate the food offerings he left at the cave mouth. But before a week was out, she had come to expect the fresh meat. The tender ground squirrels, the Arctic hares, and the plump ptarmigan. And from this, it was not really a long step to total acceptance of the wolf, who, by his every action and by his whole demeanor, expressed his self-imposed devotion to his adopted family. The neighbor fox, a gray shadow on the rocks above the cave, was the only watcher on the morning when Arnok sealed the compact with the wolf. What does that mean? Sealed the compact. Sorry? So accepted it. How? Remember, these are two wild animals. So get in near her, get in near the pups, and specifically, this is talking about mated. Sealed the compact with the wolf. Well, how do you consummate a marriage? Yeah. So they made it. The little fox watched with his usual curiosity as the big dog paused by the carcass of the fresh killed hare, then glancing past it, saw the sleeping form of the young wolf. The fox watched as the dog stepped forward slow pace at a time until she was standing close to the exhausted hunter. And the fox watched as the husky's brush wagged slowly and the wolf raised his head and the two great beasts touched nose. In the days that followed, the fox saw much of the happenings at the cave, for he was a fearless little beast, and he knew that the wolf regarded him with disinterested neutrality. Coming back from his own kits and after a mouse hunt, he would sometimes detour to pass close to the cave, and he would pause and bark sharply at the sight of 5 golden pups that flung themselves from the inert body of the wolf, snapping at his tails and ears and scratching sand into his half-closed eyes. So we're seeing this from the perspective of the fox, right? We're seeing this from a third party. So this would be what's referred to as like third person. So we're seeing a third person perspective. is what this refers to. Like that. Come on. Good enough. Coming back to here we are. Often the fox followed the wolf on long night hunts, but at a discreet distance. But this was business, and it was unsafe to come too close to the great hunter. There were long hunts, and the wolf had marked out for his adopted family a territory of nearly 100 square miles. And each night he circled his domain, harvesting the food that was now his by right. As for Arnok, her life was without complaint. There was no fears to bother her, and there was no empty spaces in her heart. As the pups grew larger, she weaned them, and then for a few hours each day, she was free to enjoy the solemn pleasure of a sunny hour lying still as death beside a lemon's run, waited for the sweet morsel of flesh that might be her reward for patience. Occasionally she visited the empty camp of men, but she no longer felt the old longing tugging at her. Her life was full. So the days passed until the pups were in their 7th week. Midsummer in the barrens, and the herds of deer were drifting southward once again. So I want to talk about the timeline that's happening here. Did anyone catch? So she left at the end of April. Anyone catch when she arrived here? June. So, and now she was there for a couple days, let's say a week, and then now we're at 7 weeks later. So we're now at 2 months later. So we got June, July, and August. So maybe we're starting to get towards like the end of summer to more the beginning of fall, beginning of winter, stuff like that. What do you think might be coming then? Winter. And with winter, what do you think might be visited in the camp? Maybe the humans. And there was also one more thing that was mentioned. The wolverine. So we have some foreshadowing here. If we really think about the time, and that's kind of happening here. So midsummer in the barrens, and the herds of deer were drifting southward once again. Remember, when does this community move? Why are they moving? The deer. So when the deer move, it's referring to the fact of the humans' movement. So the deer are moving southward once again. The crossing place was once more thronged with caribou, and the young calves grunted beside their ragged mothers, while the old bucks, their velvet-covered antlers reached into the skies, followed softly in the van. And then one evening, a desire for a long chase overcame Arnok, and in the secret ways that the men know nothing of, she made her restlessness and her desire apparent to the wolf. When the late summer dusk fell, Arnok went out alone into the darkening plains. Darkening plains. So again, we're seeing some more mentions here of words. We're seeing some more mentions here of like winter and stuff that's coming. We're seeing a darkening of the plains. It means the days are getting darker, right? That might symbolize something, but we're just going to leave darker days for now. Secure in the knowledge that the wolf would stay behind to guard the pups until her return. She did not intend a long absence, only a few hours at most, but near the outskirts of the territory, she came upon a band of young buck deer. They were fine beasts and fat, which at this time of year was a mouth-watering oddity. Tired of too much lean meat, Arnok knew a sudden surge of appetite as she circled the resting herd, filled with an ardent hunger. An eddy of the uncertain breeze betrayed her, and the startled deer sprang to their feet and fled. Arnok was hungry, and the night was a hunter's night. She took up the long chase. So the hours drove the brief night from the land, and when she heard the early winds of dawn, we see more reference here to winds. We'll figure out what that means later. The early winds of dawn rose in the north. The young wolf roused himself from his vigil by the cave mouth. A sense of dim foreboding made him turn to the den. Foreboding, we see that word again. Anyone remember what that meant? Kinda. Well, you're right, it is foreshadowing. So a sense of dim foreboding made him turn to the den and thrust his head and shoulders into the entrance. All was well, and the pups were rolled together in a compact ball, whimpering and jerking their stubby legs in the sleep. Yet the feeling of uneasiness persisted in the wolf's mind as he turned toward the river, where the gray light picked out the long rolls of distant ridges. Perhaps he was worried by the long absence of the dog. Perhaps he had been warned by senses that remain unknown to us. His uneasiness grew, and at last he trotted away from the den, following the cold trail of Arnok, hoping to see her gold form approaching from inland. He had gone no more than a mile when a vague sense of something evil took concrete form. So something evil took concrete form, which means that there's something like there. Like concrete is something you can touch, you can feel, you can see, you can sense. A vagrant eddy brought the north breeze to his nostrils, and instantly he knew what had disturbed him when he woke. He turned back towards the cave with startling speed and broke into a hard gallop. So what do you think's here? Maybe the Wolverine, maybe the humans, but there's something there. So concrete form, there's something. As he breasted the slope beside the den, the stink of Wolverine, Wolverine, rose like a foul miasma in his nostrils, and the young wolf was transformed in the instant into a savage thing, distraught with the most elemental rage. He came down the slope in half a dozen gigantic leaps, his ears flat to his skull, and his great throat rumbling with incoherent hate. The Wolverine, old and wise from a long life of slaughter, had winded the young pups in his old winter lair from a great distance off. He smelt them. He had not known any desire to revisit the foul winter den as he made his way slowly upriver, but the smell of the pups tempted him. Perhaps he would have ignored the temptation, for though he feared no living thing, he had no particular desire to meet the fury of a female wolf defending her young. So he feared no evil thing. Has anyone ever seen like a picture of a Wolverine? Massive. Yeah, it's big. He's the big dog here, right? He's like the lion in the jungle. But the night had been empty for him, and his cavernous belly rumbled with hunger. His temper, always vile, was edged by hunger, and so in the gray dawn light, he turned from the river and circled cautiously upwind until he found a rock outthrust that gave him cover, and from which he could observe the den. Here he waited with a terrible patience until he saw the young wolf trot from the den mouth towards the inland plains. Still cautiously, the Wolverine left his cover and slowly moved upon the den, pausing for long moments to reassure himself that the pups were undefended. His squat, massive body hugged the rough ground as he drew closer, and now, fully certain of success, he could already taste the pleasure of the killing and the salt warmth of blood. There was blood enough for him to taste that dawn, but it was not to be the blood of Arnok's pups. The young wolf's savage rush was so swift that the Wolverine had only sufficient time to slew about and take the weight of the attack upon his side. It was enough to save him, for the wolf's white teeth sank through the rough skin, but missed their promised hold upon the throat and met in the sinews of the killer's shoulder. On any other beast, it would have been a good hold, leading to victory, but on the Wolverine, it was not good enough. The Wolverine knows neither fear nor pain, and its squat body is possessed of a strength equal to any beast 3 times its size. A weasel by blood with all the weasel's capacity for fury, the Wolverine still has the body of a bear, and as such, its vitality. That life in it remains until the body has been literally torn apart. So it was this old beast at the cave mouth. He did not feel his injury, but instead was aflame with insane anger. He swung his 50-pound of bone and gristle into a savage counterthrust. Had the wolf been older and more experienced, he might have sidestepped that lunge, but he was young and blinded by the allegiance that he had been freely given to the pups that he had never sired. He held his grip and did not slacken it as the wolf's teeth ranked upon his unprotected flank. They fought in silence. The sun, red on the eastern rim, was pallid beside the glare of blood upon the rocks. The fox watched the terrible duel for an instant from its distant den, and then, appalled by the fury of the struggle, slunk into the dark earth and lay beside his mate and kits in trembling fear. So first off, the sun is red, probably references blood here, right? So that's referencing some blood. Who do you think wins this fight? Let's find out. It was the Gauls that warned Arnok. From afar off, as she came wearily home towards the warmth of the morning, she saw them circling and heard their striding screams. They eddied above the rocks where the den lay, and Weary as she was, she mustered her strength and came on at full pace. And so she found them, the murderer torn to bloody fragments before the murder was begun. So that's the Wolverine. And so she found the wolf, his throat ripped raggedly across and his body stiffened beneath the rising sun. The bodies still lay near a cave where, a week later, the voices of men echoed once more along the shores of the river. And they still lay by the cave a little later on when a young man called Maktuk bent down towards the dark opening and very gently thrust his hand under the frightened pups, while Arnok, half wild with old emotions, stood trembling by his side. Half wild with old emotions, the men have come. So we have old Maktuk, we have Maktuk, we have old Maktuk, the grandpa, we have Maktuk, who's the father, and we have young Maktuk, who is the son. So Arnok, half wild with old emotions. Remember, she'd given up on them. She has all these instincts in her now. So these old emotions, as when she used to be domesticated, she's more of a wild dog now, stood trembling by his side. Maktuk was a man of the Great Plains, and he could read much that could not be written, so that he knew all there was to know of which had taken place beneath the ragged rocks. And so what had taken place? Who survived the fight? Who died in the fight?
Maybe.
They both died. Yeah, they killed each other basically. Kind of, yeah. I mean, you could argue he won. Yeah, but neither survived. Yeah. And it was because he knew that on an evening in late summer, he took his son to the bank of the river and placed the boy's hand on the head of the golden dog and spoke these words: "Maktuk, my son, in a little time you shall be a man and a fine hunter, and all these wide plains will know your name and skill. And in those days to come, you will have certain friends to help you in the hunt, and of these greatest you shall always call Arnok. And then my father will know that we have received his gift, and he will be at ease. And in those times to come, all beasts shall fall to your spear and bow, save one alone. For never shall you lift your hand against the white one, against Armuk the great white wolf, and so our debt shall be paid." And so that's the end of our story here. So a couple things here. I just want to kind of go into some of our characters. So just some of our characters here. Ads. We'll do this and then we'll take a break. So I got a couple more minutes. So let's go into our old characters. So who do we have? Let's talk about the humans first. We have the three Maktuks. We have old Maktuk. We have just Maktuk, and we have young Maktuk. Now, old Maktuk, obviously, the old man left behind. He was the one who raised Arnok. We have Maktuk. He would, I guess, be like the father / son. You know, he's the middle generation. He was gifted Arnok. And we have young Maktuk, which is the son / grandson. So those are our human characters. And then what's our important animal characters? There's a couple, but let's talk about like the big ones. Obviously, we have Arnok, right? This is the mother. Yeah, you can say the young wolf. You could talk about the wolf pack, and then we also have the Wolverine. There's the fox as well, but like that's just like a third party like view, and that's something built in for the story, like to tell us what's happening here. And you can say the pups as well, but like, cool. So those are our characters. Now let's talk about our setting. So it involves a Canadian winter, and not just any Canadian winter. It talks about an Inuit winter. right? A really far up north winter. Like, what do we think like a north winter would feel like? Yeah, it'd be cold, it'd be harsh. It talks like, what's the environment like? It's a wasteland, right? We're in a wasteland. But not a lot of the story wasn't about winter. There was also what? There was also spring. Like there was summer and stuff too, but like those are the main two is winter and spring and what they mean. And then finally we have the plot. Bigger. So what the plot is, we just want to get a general summary. I'm pretty sure you guys have a pretty good understanding of the plot right now, but are you going to remember it perfectly 2 months from now? No. So this is what does 2 month older you need to know about this? You haven't looked at this for 2 months. You're gonna be reading a whole bunch more stories after this. What do we need to remember about the plot that's happened here? Well, so the very beginning of the story, what are they in? They're starving, right? Yeah, so we have starving. I'm gonna make this smaller actually. Come on. So men and dogs, they're starving to death. And so what do? They left old MacTuck is left behind to die. And what ends up happening? They leave, they go chasing this deer, and Arnuk escapes and goes back. The old man dies. We get the snow walker, right? That represents death. Arnuk dies and goes back. And then what are we going to be left with? We're going to be left with, she needs to go. So Arnuk goes towards, so she tries to find the men. When it talks about the men, it's talking about like humans, right? So she's trying to find the people. I'm just going to put people instead. Let's do that. So Arnuk tries to find the people. We encounter, she's spared by the wolf pack. She gives birth in the old camp, human camp. This is where we get spring. And we eventually meet the young wolf, right? And the young wolf eventually becomes, becomes the father, or I guess raises. Young wolf adoptive father. We'll just put that instead. If young wolf is the adoptive father, we have the Wolverine and young wolf fight. And then we have the people return. There's a lot more that happened in there, right? There's a lot more, but again, there's a summary there. You'll have to kind of understand some of the stuff that's in between that, but we're just giving you 2 months from now a quick summary. This is meant to jog your memory. If there's more stuff in here that you're worried you might forget, you can add that in there. If there's a whole lot more, like, you know, how did the young wolf win over the Arnuk, right? Like there was all those gifts, there was that protection, there was waiting a long time, all that stuff. But this is just meant to be a quick, let's get our brain fired on when you give this a read. So once you have that done, why don't we go for our break? We're going to talk a little bit about some of the, actually we won't. I don't think we will. Yeah, why don't we go for our break here, and I will think about what I want to do next. Let's pause this. Talk about, I'll cut you guys loose in a moment, but I just want to quickly talk about some of our themes and our symbols here and what they mean. These are some of the ones here. You could probably find more if you wanted. Like there's those unwritten laws and stuff like that. There's the snow walker, but these are just some of the big ones. Because remember, we care a lot about the landscapes and how that references how the story moves on. Remember, as in the painted door, as the storm got worse, Anne's brooding got worse, for example, right? We see a lot of those similar types of elements that happen here. They just mean different things. So let's get into some of this stuff here. I would recommend taking notes of this, but I will upload this after as well. Just for the sake of time. Ooh. I'm gonna move this down here. Here we go. So just for the sake of time, we have first three of our big themes here is first off, it's a cold and harsh landscape. What did we see happen in like the first two paragraphs of the story? They let it, well, people are starving, they're dying, and they left the old man there to die. You have to make cold and harsh decisions. When it's talking about this cold and harsh landscape, it's referring to the fact that you need to make those cold and harsh decisions. When we see like those laws get broken, like when Arnott ventures into like that wolf's territory, technically it probably should be dead. Like she invited death, right? The only thing that's fair was the fact that like there was that she's pregnant, there's that law with that. And not only that, like there's this resiliency to survive. You need to have that willpower, that force, that effort to survive here. In the spring, we talked about that quite a bit. We don't need to go much deeper than that. Spring's referring to the fact that there's new life, there's an explosion of new life. You know, talking about the squirrels, the fox, you know, her, the deer, the caribou, all those things, you know, boom, everyone has babies. And then towards the end of the summer, this is more towards the end of the story. How come she went on a hunt again? Arnott went on this hunt because there was all these new caribou and stuff that kind of came. Like she had this sudden urge to do it, but that's what she was hunting. All these new caribous and deer that were coming by. And specifically, you mentioned how they had these like babies falling behind them. This is kind of referring to the fact that, you know, people are going off on new journeys. It's this new like coming of age where people or animals are going to grow, animals and people are going to grow into adulthood and responsibility. The humans come back, and old Mac Tuck tells young Mac Tuck that he, you know, eventually he's gonna become a hunter. He's gonna be well known throughout the lands and stuff like that. So it's his coming of age story as well. These are some of our themes, and we also had a couple other ones. We have the bonds of men and dogs. We have the winds. Like, what do those winds mean? We have new dawn and morning and darkness and night. I really quickly want to talk about these bottom three here, particularly our landscapes. Now, we'll start with the bottom here, darkness and night. What do you think that might represent? Every time we see this happen in the story, we see darkness and night. There's always this something that might happen. Any guesses? Something bad. Yeah, it might mean something bad has happened, right? There's that foreboding thing. So maybe for the new dawn and morning, any guesses what that might be?
Like new life.
Well, that's what spring is. Oh. Any guesses? Like what might like a new dawn mean? Hope. So could mean hope. That could be one thing. Could be transformation or change. And then the winds, what might the winds be? Any guesses? We didn't pay a lot of attention to it as we went through, but
Shit.
the struggle. So it could be a struggle. Oh, so maybe their emotions, maybe like a change in that. So let's find out. So winds we usually associate with like change and stuff like that, with struggle. Like whenever there's not only that, like this goes back to like this struggle to survive, right? It's this reminder that, you know, even though Arnott's is really big, strong, like dog, just like still nature can still completely just wipe them out. New dawn is usually like new hopes, right? It's like you made it through this dark night. It's a sense of change as well. New hopes usually refers to some change. A new dawn, like a new morning, is usually changes. There's a change that's happening. Darkness and night. It's a threat of death. It's danger. It's isolation. It's loneliness. It's all these things. So good work. For the most part, we've got this. Bonds of men and dogs. Again, time doesn't end relationships. Those instincts come back. But it also refers to these two things, about preserving the cultural heritage and it's preserving the balance of that natural world as well. Oop, sorry. Okay, so what you guys will get the rest of the day to do is we just have this that was handed out earlier. Like I said, it's 3 parts. The first one's just some comprehension stuff. This is 4 marks. It should, for the most part, be some easy marks for you guys. But basically, one of it is just understanding what happened in the story. The other one is analyzing some of these quotes. Specifically, it's going to talk about like how come this is an important quote to the story. Why is it important to the story? What is it referring to? Don't just take it literally. Sometimes you might need to, but it's usually referring to something a little bit deeper than that. You know, we talked about this one here. You know, how come Arnok, a dog, is such a really precious gift? You know, it's analyzing that stuff. And then the third part is just some writing parts of it. You want to try and do at least a paragraph for each of these. Now, there's 2 of them, the ones I have here. First off, this is asking you a lot of stuff. Read this carefully, try and answer it all. It's a very long-winded question. It asks you like 4 different things. So read it carefully, make sure that you're responding to everything there. This bottom one here is not for marks, but like I said, we want to have some of that practice here. How is the landscape important? Those 7 symbols we just talked about, you might now have to go in and find some proof to talk about some of that stuff. You should all be able to at least do a paragraph for that, if not 2, maybe even 3, but you should all be prepared now to be able to write about the landscape and how that works towards the story, what its role is, what it references, the characters, the struggle to survive, all that stuff. You should be able to mention all of that stuff within here. The cold and harsh environment, the spring, the summer, the winds, all those things you should be able to now mention within there. So Remember, the writing part is really, really important. These are not worth a lot of marks, but if you can do these well, you will be prepared for that departmental. If you can just do these parts here, you're missing some stuff. We have to make sure that we are right in deep. We are referencing the story. I'm making a claim. I'm going to back it up with something that happened in the story or a quote. We are not just summarizing the plot for this. We need to reference it and build an argument towards something. So I'll let you guys get into that here. Please let me know if you have any help. You might get a little bit of time tomorrow. I can't promise that, but you might get some time to work on this as well.
When is this due?
Good question. This is